All right, hello everybody. We're going to talk about virtualization and the idea of live migration. Live migration is the idea that a virtual machine can save its state and its data and then actually transfer that data in those states while these services are still running. And today we're going to look into how you manage to do that. Before though, we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction. So virtualization is, by definition, basically one machine can host, partition, and run multiple instances of an operating system. And the idea of virtualization is to maximize those resources on the machine, and it is utilized to consolidate and essentially optimize what's going on that machine. It started on a single machine and then slowly evolved to multiple machines. And that's just kind of evident in the evolution of technology, right? The advantages and disadvantages, though, of live migration and virtualization are a little few and far between, but for the most part, the advantages of migration is that it creates a model for running large scale services. So if you want to look back to Amazon and their order of operation, you generally will see things like their microtransactions and stuff like that running on virtual machines. And I probably would believe that if they didn't have virtualization in large data centers, they would not be able to handle the load or the demand that they see today. With that being said, some of the disadvantages of machine or virtual machines and live migration is that it has to be done while the services are live. So if you recover lost data, it might be easier to handle that with like a RAID setup with some hard drives or something. But when you have large data sets, it becomes very, very complicated. In addition, if you have to do some maintenance on the machine itself, like the server hardware, how do you migrate the machines that are on that server to another server that's probably under load and allow you to do the maintenance on that server without actually shutting down the whole service? And then lastly, we'll get into this a little bit later, but um, virtual machines and live migration within these data centers, one of the big things that they look at is power consumption, because some of these large data centers actually can take as much power as a small city. So finding ways to maximize resources while optimizing power consumptions and costs are some of the things that people are looking to nowadays. A little bit of background on how this all came to be. Alan Turing, you might have heard of him through World War II. He's pretty well known for cracking the Enigma machine for the Germans, and allowed the Americans and the Allied forces to sink a lot of U-boats that were causing a lot of problems for the Allied forces. His Turing machines basically saved states, and they were able to do basic computations. And they were basically pretty rigid. They weren't very complex, and they were rule based. So they didn't really have any kind of way to increase their complexity. Now, in the 1950s, new hardware was being created, but compatibility for these new hardware pieces wasn't very well implemented yet. So whenever a new hardware was created, even though the software that ran the previous version of this hardware was fairly similar, these guys had to rewrite the entire software to accommodate this new hardware. This created an incentive to create more portable programs. And in the 1960s, partitioning became a thing. This allows multiple users to utilize the machine's resources. It was actually a pretty big step in virtualization. Shortly after, time sharing became a thing, which is basically large-scale utilization of partitioning. And the aim was to increase efficiency of both users and the computer resources. With the 1970s came the implementation of virtualization, and it was roughly about this time that you started to see the actual idea of virtual machines that we see today come to fruition. With the first successful TCP/IP connection in January of 1983, we finally started getting the wheels rolling for the internet. And in 1985, actually, the Simul task was released. And this enabled the direct execution of Intel 8086, or more similarly known as the x86 architecture, to basically run under a Unix system and for them to run simultaneously but independent of each other. Shortly after, in 1987, support for multiple simultaneous virtual machines was released with the merge and the 386 software. The first version of the virtual PC was for Macintosh and was released about a decade later. It was released by Connectix, and this was really the first time that a virtual PC was actually at the forefront of technology. And then finally, in 2003, the first open source hypervisor was released. It was called Zen, and basically the hypervisor is the overarching component that manages all the virtual machines below it. So there are two main ways that you can do live migration, which is the idea of transferring data from one server to another. And one of them is Precopy. So Precopy is basically the idea that you take all of the data and you transfer the data, then you transfer the virtual machine and its states over to the new server, and then you configure it that way. There are three phases to Precopy. You have a push, then the migration itself, and then a pull phase. In all of these models, dirty pages are created during migration. It's just a natural process. Dirty pages are basically new modified pages that basically haven't been written into those pages. So if you think about an essay, for instance, a dirty page would be you write a new paragraph and you don't save it. So generally, these dirty pages are regenerated on the source machine during migration, and they can be sent multiple times, which is why it could potentially be a little inefficient. There is the migration phase where you transfer all the data, and then eventually you'll get into the pull phase. Well, the pull phase is kind of the termination phase that kind of tells the hypervisor and the system that it's done with the migration. The couple conditions that can cause the pull phase is the number of iterations is met. So let's say you have 2,000 pages and you only want to transfer 1,000 of them. Then once 1,000 of them are transferred, then the pull phase is created. The virtual machine is now canceled on the source server, and then you would have to do another migration to get the other 1,000. Another condition could be that memory is exceeded. Obviously, if you don't have enough memory, it's ill-advised to transfer more data to unallocated memory. And then the last condition is actually if the number of dirty pages is below a threshold. So let's say that you have 1,000 pages and 200 of those are dirty. Well, let's say you start your transfer and it's doing its algorithm, and then finally it hits 25 dirty pages. Well, this threshold at 25 will eventually cause this pull phase, and the rest of the remaining pages are sent, as well as the processor state and its remaining memory components. In Postcopy, the steps are kind of switched. So the virtual machine is going to actually be transferred first. So the CPU states, the memory configuration, so on and so forth, those are going to be transferred first. And then after that, then the memory content and the storage data and the things that you're more or less going to be interested in are then transferred. There are four main techniques in Postcopy. They're more or less kind of similar, but for the most part, they have their own uses. So the first one is demand paging. It's usually the slowest option. Fairly straightforward though. The virtual machine that's on the destination server after being transferred requests the pages on the source server, and they're only sent once over the network. So you're not really going to have any complications with these pages, but there's no optimization there, and it's not really going to help you if you have very, very large data sets. The next one is you have active push copy, which is like demand paging, but removes those dependencies from the source server and pushes pages on the new VM. Pre-paging is another type which sends requests to the destination server for future access to pages. So it's like basically almost like pre-copy, but in the post-copy sense. And then finally you have dynamic self-ballooning, which reduces the number of free memory pages that are transferred. Ideally, the less information you transfer, the faster these are going to work. There was a reasonable performance in live migration, right? But what's interesting is migration, more or less, is on the post-copy side. It's good, but in general practice in the industry, you're going to see pre-copy more often. As you can see on this slide, pre-copy is on the left, post-copy on the right. Pre-copy is definitely much easier, and the flowchart's just simpler and easier to implement than, say, post-copy. But in pre-copy, you basically select the destination server. You select memory to allocate on the destination server as well, and you capture the whole virtual memory state and assume that it's dirty. At that point, you move into the migration phase and you continue to iteratively copy and migrate these pages over to destination server. And then once that's done, then you do the pull phase and you resume the virtual machine on the destination server. On the post copy method, it kind of does the same thing, where you choose a destination server and the resource allocation of that, but this time you actually capture the virtual machine states like the CPU registers, memory state, and you transfer that to the destination server. From there, the source virtual machine now starts to send the memory pages and iteratively start migrating the virtual machine over. And then once that happens, then you can do the pull phase and the migration's over. So now we're going to look at a couple migration models. There are many models. Some of them are optimization, some of them there for research, but ultimately the idea is to create an ideal solution for whatever model you're looking for your services. The first one we'll look at is a load balancing model for virtual clusters. So we're looking at large data centers and things like that. It was proposed by Xing Li and his researchers, and they were looking at three main issues. So they were trying to optimize the selection of the virtual machine on the destination server, and that issue is more important than you think, because selecting the wrong virtual machine on the destination server could cause more overhead. So let's say you have virtual machine that's halfway loaded, and then you have one that's, let's say, 80% loaded, right? And you pick the 80% first. There's still going to be some extra time that has to happen to balance that the 80% load to the 50%, and it might have been more advantageous to do the 50% first. Same goes with the destination virtual machine, right? Um, like the source machine, you don't want to pick something that's gonna cause you to do extra steps. And then lastly, you have the execution of the migration. So the order at which these virtual machines are transferred or migrated was actually important to them. And it goes kind of without saying that all of these are important, but even more so, Xing Li and his researchers managed to find a migration time about 60 milliseconds. So in the realm of human perception of time, 60 milliseconds really isn't that long. It's almost unnoticeable, and if you're on a web page, you probably won't notice it because of all the loading that's going on, especially in Chrome. This next model is once again on cloud-based computation and large data networks, but we're also looking at cloud computation in edge networks. This model was proposed by Walter Cerrone and Franco Gatti, and they were looking at two kinds of migrations. So the first one is sequential virtual machine migration, where each of the M virtual machines, the total number of virtual machines, are migrated one at a time at max channel bandwidth. So that would be the equivalent of downloading one movie at a time at the maximum amount of bandwidth that you have. As you know, for most of our experiences, that is pretty stable. And the ith migration, or the maximum amount of iterations are met, then the pull phase comes through and finishes up the migration. With their other solution, they were advocating for parallel virtual machine migration, where all of the virtual machines are migrated simultaneously, but they must share bandwidth. So basically, let's say you had 100 virtual machines and you wanted to transfer them, you would transfer all of them at the same time. So imagine trying to download 100 different movies at the same time on your internet connection. It's definitely going to change the way that it works, but interestingly enough, parallel migration is actually better when the bit rate for transferring all of these virtual machines and their information is significantly lower than the maximum bandwidth of the channel. So let's say you have a migration, it only takes 10 to 20% of the maximum bandwidth. This parallel migration is actually going to perform better. But as the ratio between memory, the memory dirty rate, and the transmission channel bit rate becomes very large, sequential migration becomes more attractive, simply because the individual virtual machine can utilize more of the network per se and create this stable migration of all of this data, more so than having to mitigate and manage 100 different virtual machines at the same time. So this third one is kind of interesting because it's more or less a prediction model to optimize performance over a WAN network. But more importantly, this one is a hybrid method, and I wanted to bring this up because it is actually a thing that you can take Precopy and Postcopy methods and turn them into a hybrid method. This model was proposed by Weide Zhang and her researchers, and she was looking at the optimal search for both memory and storage. With that, she created a recursive ternary search algorithm, and you can look at this algorithm in our paper with I think it's figure 3, and it's actually a pretty small amount of code, but it acts pretty close to like traversing a ternary tree instead of a binary tree. Then they extend the Zen hypervisor, their manager, to include Postcopy, since the Zen manager only includes Precopy. And then the remaining memory pages are defined in a bitmap for the Postcopy phase. They use trunks or more or less buckets of dirty pages in a priority queue with a weight on the access frequency. So let's say that a page is accessed more than another page, that more access page is going to have a higher weight, and that leads them to migrate the least access trunks or buckets, so to speak, first. And then lastly, they use whole page overriding to optimize the bandwidth by reducing the number of dirty pages. And the way that that works is basically right before it gets sent, the entire dirty page is overwritten, so it's essentially a clean page. And this creates less overhead, less overriding, all of that stuff to create the least amount of instructions to migrate this data over. There are some limitations to virtual migration, and one of the biggest ones is the network bandwidth and connection, right? So if you don't have a great bandwidth or a great internet service provider, it's definitely going to take considerably longer. And for some services, that might not be an incentive. It might not be ideal, so they'll probably sway away from that. And the connection, right? So if the connection's faulty or there's a lot of gaps in the connection, it could definitely impact what data packets actually do get sent. And like demand paging and postcopy, if it's only sent once, that might prove to be a big problem. Another limitation is downtime. We looked at this a little bit with the first model, and the thing is we want to minimize the downtime of the migration because, in a sense, the program is still not running, and when you have large data centers and you require a lot of resources, having downtime is not ideal. Another limitation is the available memory. So obviously bigger data centers can handle more migrations and computations, right? But you do want to have enough memory to handle all of this. Cost logistics, so like we said earlier, power consumption, heating, cooling, staffing, all of these different logistics go into the limitations of what you can and can't do as a data center or as some other guy that's trying to implement virtualization in his own time. And then lastly, there are some economical and environmental impacts. Since data centers require a lot of power and draw a lot of power, there is some economical impacts there. But more importantly, too, it generates a lot of heat, and the cooling of these machines actually impact the surrounding ecosystem to the data center. So one of the big things about the digital world is that security is definitely one of the biggest assets you can have. There are three planes of vulnerability generally in a migration model. There's the control plane, the data plane, and the migration model itself, which is basically the software that's incorporated to actually migrate this stuff. There's been a massive increase in organized cybercrime, especially as of late, the last 4 or 5 years. I know for a fact that in the spring of 2020, Tesla, or I believe in fall actually, but Tesla was almost hacked, and they were using an insider attack where an employee was approached by the organization, and he was offered a large sum of money and some incentives for him to go in and log in and allow these guys to do whatever they were going to do. Fortunately for Tesla, this guy turned them in, and I don't know if he was employee of the month or if he got any money, but that never happened. On a more serious note, Cyberpunk, you might have heard of the game. It got hit by a ransomware attack, and what a ransomware attack is you take your code and then they inject an encryption algorithm that scrambles up your code so it doesn't work, and then they demand payment with a time window. So let's say you have 48 hours to pay $100,000, or you'll permanently lose your IP or your intellectual property, so to speak. And that puts a lot of pressure on people, but it is there, and you want to try and prevent that as much as possible. So since migration is relatively new, these services are attractive for exploitation, and because of that, some financial, medical, and government-oriented industries do not utilize live migration and its models. Okay, so in the control plane, the largest area of vulnerability stems here. You'll see a lot of things that you would normally see in normal attacks. So, a denial of service attack would be an attack where VMs are actually created on the destination host, so no new virtual machines can be created. Much like how so many packets are sent to a TCP connection on a DOS attack, so that way no other connections can be made. There's the idea of like a viral virtual machine that is migrated into the system, and it will basically infect the virtual machine monitor with malicious code, which then distributes it to the rest of the virtual machines in the system. Very, very, very serious. You could potentially, as an attacker, load many unneeded virtual machines, causing a load balancing to a forced migration point. So if there's a way to migrate virtual machines to an attacker computer, that could definitely be a thing. And the big concern is giving full control, because once you have full control of the whole model, it's pretty hard to get it back. One interesting way to do this too is to falsely advertise for migration and force virtual migration to an attacker host. And lastly, you could have any combination of these together. Okay, so we got the data plane as well, and the data plane is basically the memory and the states which are transferred from the source and destination server. This data plane is not necessarily targeted as much, but it is still susceptible to both passive and active attacks. So an active attack is fairly aggressive for the most part, trying to modify or alter the data while it's being migrated to potentially receive some kind of outcome. Maybe you found a password and you inject it into the migrating virtual machine, and later on, once that's all taken care of, then you log in normally and you have access to things that you normally shouldn't have. In a passive attack, the idea is to just sit back and acquire information from the migrating VM. So it could be anywhere between passwords, keys, messages, authenticated packets. And for the large part, if somebody is listening in on your channel, they might be pretty diligent about how they go about things, but they could be there for a very long time and you would never know it. So it's just good to have that kind of security on those forefronts. And then lastly, we have the migration model. So this is the software component of the migration model. Definitely vulnerable to typical software security issues. And the biggest concern, once again, is full control, because once a compromised virtual machine is compromised, then it compromises the whole system. So looking at low security systems, it might have a bigger chance of being exploited or attacked, simply because that system is easier to grab the information. Not all is lost. There are some security solutions. So one of them is to isolate the migration network. So, just have a closed network where there's no connection to the outside world. And that will largely prevent external attacks over the network. You could extend the firewall and the intrusion detection system or the intrusion prevention system to the hypervisor. And that creates basically a full shield of coverage around the system. And if it doesn't, then at least it will be able to identify and alert somebody that something is malicious and could be happening right now. One of the other easy ways to go about this is SSH in tunnels, simply because as an SSH in tunnels, you only have a 2-lane highway. Nobody ever know. You could also authenticate every check through every step of the process. Doesn't happen in practice. It takes too long. And then lastly, you can have hybrid versions of these that incorporate multiple methods, which will then increase the security of your product, and more importantly, give you a sense of security where people just aren't necessarily socially calibrated. Okay, so there are some future directions that virtual migration is going into, and for the large part, optimization of their models is pretty much what a lot of people are focusing on right now. So the CPU states, the memory size, transfer of the memory, utilization of resources, stuff like that. These are all things that we can optimize and hopefully improve on the current services that we have now. One of those optimizations is saving power, and I put this in its own note because it is a very big thing. While electricity is not very expensive, when you do have a large, essentially factory, creating these massive vats of power is, it adds up very quickly. So, as an aside, the idle server uses 70% of its max power versus less than 10% while it's sleeping. So it would definitely behoove the person to take care of the load balancing issue before the max power comes into play, because even though it is a large part of who we are as people, might be good to just roll up your teeth and roll basically just make it so that way you're not using all of one machine and all of another machine and underloading another machine. Okay, so in conclusion, live migration is actually a pretty viable method for management of resources and system stability. With these large data centers like Amazon and them, they're getting attacked all the time, and they're very rugged and allow for some of these services to even exist. We do know that there are challenges and advantages to live migration, but for the most part, it is advantageous to do stuff like this, provided that these models are stable and successful in the realm of their execution and security. There's a lot of areas for research and optimization. You can go into just power consumption. We were looking at search algorithms, things over a WAN network. All these different ways to migrate data is definitely starting to become a possibility now. So as I said earlier, Amazon and people that have services like that, large-scale services, they are capable of doing these microtransactions because of those large-scale data centers and their ability to migrate information while running. There's the idea of protecting against attackers and other threats to migration models, and it's actually advised that using a public cloud to handle your private transactions is actually somewhat better, because a public domain may have more experience than the private domain in whatever scope they're looking for. And then lastly, I think the concept is here to stay. It's definitely not going away. And I found this concept very, very interesting, because uh, a lot of what we do comes from this stuff. And it's very interesting how to do and implement these things, but more importantly, just having a system or a model that can handle large scale services is something that will probably not go away for a very long time. So with that, that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for stopping by. Enjoy the rest of your day.